I'm presenting some new work, and I have to admit that I hate presenting new work because it's undercooked, but all of our work starts with a few undercooked ideas. I'm going to be talking about Bill Maher's brand of Islamophobia that he routinely promotes on his long-standing HBO political talk show, Real Time with Bill Maher. Given that much conversation about what we refer to as Islamophobia, which I will refer to as anti-Muslim racism, and we can talk more about why during the Q&A. It's been a debate within people who study Islamophobia, what's the better term to use, and many have started using the term anti-Muslim racism. So much of the work about anti-Muslim racism tends to focus on the political right as its key perpetrators. And I'm interested in examining the ways in which those on the political left are complicit in perpetuating notions that Islam is incompatible with democracy and liberal principles. It at times appears to be little, if any, distinction between the right and the left when it comes to conversations about Islam. I'm building on the work of scholars like Stephen Salaita, who in his book, The Uncultured Wars, has written extensively on how the left promotes anti-Muslim racism, revealing that such ideologies are not unique to the right. So what I would like to do is show you a clip to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Many of you have likely seen this, but on October 3rd, 2014, the panel on the HBO show Real Time with Bill Maher included New York Times bestselling author Sam Harris, actor-filmmaker Ben Affleck, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicholas Kristof, and former chairperson of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele. One topic addressed was that Islam clashes with liberal principles, and that liberals are failing to point this out because of their commitment to political correctness, which is an argument Bill Maher often makes in his long-running show. This episode, and others with a similar message, have led to a national conversation, as evidenced by a slew of op-eds and news coverage of Bill Maher's various panels, in which Islam's diversity, or lack thereof, was debated. After we watch the clip, I'm going to show about 4 minutes, I will outline how Bill Maher reproduces textbook strategies of the Islamophobia industry. And some of you, many of my colleagues have referred to the Islamophobia industry, but for those of you not familiar, Nathan Lean published a book called The Islamophobia Industry. The Council on American Islamic Relations has a website, I think it's islamophobia.org, where they track people who basically make a living promoting Islamophobic ideas. And after the clip, I'll reflect on two concepts that are proposed in the clip. One is that Muslims are antithetical to liberal principles, and the other is that the only way to reconcile this bind is through the quote-unquote nominal Muslim. So I'll get into talking about what is the nominal Muslim, who is positioned as the only hope for allowing Muslims to enter liberalism. So what are the implications of such an approach? So I'm going to play.
Make the case, I think, I have anyway, that liberals need to stand up for liberal principles. This is what I said on last week's show. Obviously, I got a lot of hate for it, but all I'm saying is that liberal principles like freedom of speech, freedom to practice any religion you want without fear of violence, freedom to leave a religion, equality for women, equality for minorities, including homosexuals. These are liberal principles that liberals applaud for. But then when you say in the Muslim world this is what's lacking, then they get upset.
Yeah. Well, liberals have really failed on the topic of theocracy. They'll criticize white theocracy. They'll criticize Christians. They'll still get agitated over the abortion clinic bombing that happened in 1984. But when you want to talk about the treatment of women and homosexuals and free thinkers and public intellectuals in the Muslim world, I would argue that liberals have failed us. And the crucial point of confusion, thank you.
Thank God you're here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the crucial point of confusion is that we have been sold this meme of Islamophobia, where every criticism of the doctrine of Islam gets conflated with bigotry toward Muslims as people.
Right.
That is it's intellectually ridiculous. Even it gets
So hold on, are you the person who understands the officially codified doctrine of Islam? You're the interpreter, so you can say, well, this is...
I'm actually well educated on this topic.
I'm asking you, so you're saying if I criticize you're saying that Islamophobia is not a real thing? That if you're critical of something...
Well, it's not a real thing when we do it.
Right.
Well, no,
it really is.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people, and that's a problem.
Bigoted.
But
But why are you so hostile about this?
It's gross, it's racist.
It's not, but it's so
It's
not.
so, it's like saying, look,
So
say
not.
you're a shifty Jew.
You're not listening
Absolutely
to
not.
what we are saying.
You guys are saying, if you want to be liberals, believe in liberal principles,
Right.
like freedom of speech, like,
Right.
we were endowed by our forefathers with an inalienable rights, right? All men are created equal.
No.
Ben, we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
Of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to
Okay,
criticize bad
but
ideas.
Islam
But why
Islam
would-
is the mother lode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So we have
That's just
ideas
a
like
fact.
blasphemy.
It is an ugly thing.
Apostasy.
It's basic liberal
Well, let me
principle
unpack
of
it.
tolerance.
Let me unpack
But
it.
not for
No,
intolerance.
of course not. But the picture you're painting is to some extent true, but is hugely incomplete. It is certainly true that plenty of fanatics and jihadis are Muslim, but the people who are standing up to them, Malala, incredible Muhammad Ali Dadak in Iran, in prison for 9 years for speaking up for Christians. A friend that I had in Pakistan who was shot this year, Rashid Rahman, for defending people accused of apostasy.
But Nick,
Or how about the more than a billion people
those
who
are
aren't
Muslims.
fanatical, who don't punch
Well, but I think
who just want to go to
Okay,
school?
wait a second. Wait a second.
Any of the things we're listening.
Okay. I'm trying to fast forward to
Almost
the
right.
clip, but I don't think I can. Okay, well,
Let him talk.
towards the end, Ben Affleck says, well, what's your solution? And Sam Harris says, we need to prop up the nominal Muslims to reform the faith. So, okay. So the first time I watched this debate on Real Time with Bill Maher, it left me speechless. I could not believe that Bill Maher and Sam Harris, who identify as politically liberal, were arguing that Islam lacks diversity in its practices and attitudes, that the 1.6 billion Muslims of the world are essentially the same, against liberal principles like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and against equal rights for women and LGBTQ people. When actor Ben Affleck pointed out to Maher and Harris that they were overgeneralizing, indicting an entire people and religion, and therefore promoting bigotry, Maher and Harris held to their argument that Islam is incompatible with liberal principles, claiming that they are simply and legitimately criticizing bad ideas that liberals fail to criticize. Among the left, Islamophobia is often understood as fueled by hatred and ignorance and perpetuated by the right. It is most often recognized as efforts to marginalize Muslims through laws like the Patriot Act, an Islamophobia industry, and hate crimes against Muslims and mosques. Among the right, Islamophobia is often seen as a term that shuts down criticism of Islam and is evidence that political correctness avoids facing real problems like terrorism. In this case, Maher is using the same arguments used by the right by stating that liberals are avoiding criticizing Islam because of their commitment to political correctness. Similarly, both those on the left and the right of the political spectrum do not regard their discourse as contributing to anti-Muslim racism. Like with other kinds of racism, those who perpetuate it do not identify with the term and exempt themselves from being associated with it. Many of us have heard, I'm not a racist, but as a phrase, and that kind of phraseology was happening in this segment. Bill Maher states that Islamophobia is a real problem, but not when he's doing it. Bill Maher and Sam Harris see themselves as distinct from and critics of the Islamophobia industry and the political right's brand of anti-Muslim racism, yet they are reproducing many of the same strategies in the production and dissemination of anti-Muslim logics. For example, gross generalizations. Some scholars like Deepa Kumar, Swad Joseph, Council on American Islamic Relations has also done this, have created these lists, these features where you can identify common ways in which these logics are produced. So this is some of the examples. Gross overgeneralizations, a monolithic portrait of Islam, insisting that the 1.6 billion Muslims of the world are largely the same. A tendency to discuss Muslims as uniquely X, uniquely sexist, homophobic, violent, intolerant, unreasonable, etc., as if such problems were resolved in Western countries centuries ago, or simply were never part of Western countries. So there's a built-in amnesia here where slavery never happened, Jim Crow never happened, police violence, gender wage gap are not problems in the United States. And of course, we also have Islam here being figured as something foreign, not as something domestic. So it's very much associated with Arabs, South Asian, Iranians, etc. Criticisms of liberals is very common for their unwillingness to face facts and for being more concerned with political correctness than addressing real problems with Islam. The use of native informants is also very common, and Bill Maher routinely invites Muslim women to his show to confirm his point of view, and the assumption that there is no debate within Islam, that Muslims are portrayed as passive, unchanging, and in need of the West to intervene and promote social change. So I just wanted to point out that these are not unique to the political right and very common across the political spectrum. So I'd like to turn now to thinking about two of Bill Maher and Sam Harris's propositions, that Islam is against liberal principles, and that nominal Muslims are the solution to reforming Islam and making it aligned with liberal principles. What are the implications of such an approach on Muslims in liberal democracies? I will argue that liberalism produces certain kinds of acceptable Muslims. Many of us are familiar with the good Muslim who comes in the form of a patriotic American. The term good Muslim that many of us use came out of Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, and the panel before, Edward Curtis, took us through a very detailed insight into what the patriotic Muslim looks like, and Mujahid also took us into this term in a very detailed way. And some of us are familiar with the former Muslim, such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who often serve as native informants to the Islamophobia industry. Maher and Harris offer us the nominal Muslim, and Christoph and Steele, we didn't hear Michael Steele in this clip, but he chimes in with Christoph in challenging Maher and Harris, and they offer us the heroic Muslim. So I should note that the patriotic Muslim, the former Muslim, the nominal Muslim, the heroic Muslim, they're not mutually exclusive. They do tend to overlap quite a bit. Scholar Joseph Massad, in his book Islam and Liberalism, reflects on how Western liberalism has produced meanings about Islam as its opposite. I have a quote just to make it clear. Opposed to freedom, liberty, equality, the right-bearing individual, democratic citizenship, women's rights, sexual rights, freedom of belief, secularism, rationality, etc. In short, as a pathology and a form of neurosis that must not only be vanquished, but also psychoanalyzed, end quote. Massad argues that Islam has been central to the formation of liberalism as an ideology and political identity, in the same way that Edward Said in Orientalism describes Orientalism as central to the formation of European identity in the 19th century, in that Islam became the other through which Western liberalism would define itself. In other words, Massad shows that pitting Islam against liberalism is not new, and that there is a long and complex history of constructing these entities as binary opposites. The assumptions of liberalism are built into the terms of the debate itself, regardless of whether or not one identifies as being on the political left or right. So it's not really about the left adopting right-wing tactics, but about how these tactics rely on and reinforce the same problematic form of liberalism. I'm suggesting that while it often seems like the political right and left are worlds apart, the similar approach to Islam has less to do with one's position on the political spectrum and more to do with the ways in which both draw on liberalism as taken for granted political ideology. So what I'm trying to say is we tend to think about the left and the right as very different, but both are drawing on liberalism in the sense of the United States being founded on liberal principles, liberty, equality, freedom. But the main distinction, if we want to talk about Democrats and Republicans, is that Republicans believe that the government shouldn't be involved, just leave it alone and we'll be full of liberty and freedom. And Democrats tend to think that the government should be involved to guarantee liberty, but in both cases it's liberal principles that are being promoted and adopted as an unquestioned assumption. So if Islam and liberalism are opposed, then the only way to reconcile this divide is through exceptional Muslims who are not opposed to liberalism. So who are these Muslims? So let's go back to this slide. Harris says, and here's the quote, "There are hundreds of millions of Muslims who are nominal Muslims, who don't take the faith seriously, who don't want to kill apostates, who are horrified by ISIS, and we need to defend these people, prop them up, and let them reform their faith." Harris assumes, end quote, Harris assumes that Islam is practiced in a singular way, and thus that the entire religion needs reform. Who should lead this reform movement? Nominal Muslims. Who are nominal Muslims? Those who are Muslim only in name, but not in practice. Someone who was raised Muslim, but for whom Islam is insignificant in their lives. This could take the form of the Muslim defector, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, or like Asr Nomani, the Muslim critic reformer. And here we see the continuation of an age-old colonial strategy of using particular groups of natives to assimilate others. It is assumed that Muslims have no capacity for agency unless it is activated and directed by the West. In addition, Muslims who are not religious or who have left Islam are embraced or propped up as those who should reform the religion. Where is the line between the nominal Muslim, the native informant, the moderate Muslim, and the good Muslim? Much has been written about these various types of Muslims produced in Western discourses. It seems to me that the nominal Muslim is not the same as the moderate Muslim. The moderate Muslim can still be Muslim, but knows to keep their religion private. The nominal Muslim, however, is either no longer a practicing Muslim or has left the religion entirely. So in other words, this version of the good Muslim is no longer Muslim. Maher and Harris position themselves as courageous for speaking out, despite the norms of political correctness. They also position nominal Muslims as courageous for risking their lives to speak out against Islam. And I was noting on Salah's slide with Robert Spencer, it mentioned his courage. So there's this narrative of courage. The use of the language of courage and bravery serves to co-opt courage, to morally position this perspective that Islam and liberal are incompatible as the more courageous one in speaking out against injustice. But courage also plays a central role in Christoph and Steele's disagreement with the portrait of Islam that is promoted by Maher and Harris. They do not see Islam as incompatible with liberalism, and to make their point, they list courageous Muslims who fight for humanity and speak out against injustice. According to Christoph, there are Muslim heroes who present a more diverse portrait of Islam. These are Muslims who have been victimized, like Malala Yousafzai, who has fought, and others who have fought for their rights and for the rights of others. He mentions Muhammad Ali in passing. What is important here is that Christoph is challenging Maher's depiction of Muslims as having no agency unless activated by the West. He's showing Muslims do have agency and do fight for liberal principles and risk their lives doing it. It's an important challenge, but it also reinscribes the notion that to be Muslim is essentially to be a victim unless one has the courage to be a hero. And then we have Ben Affleck's challenge to Maher and Christoph, which oddly ends up being the most astute criticism in this debate. And I say oddly because I've written and criticized Argo, so it's odd to see his position here. He says, how about the over 1 billion Muslim people who aren't fanatical, who don't punch women, who just want to go to school and have some sandwiches, pray 5 times a day, here he is, and don't do any of those things, end quote. He importantly points out that Maher and Harris are painting a monolithic image of Islam as fanatical and unreasonable, and challenges it through the ordinary Muslim who wants to eat sandwiches. He's pointing out, what about Muslims who are just people living their lives, who are not heroes or nominal or patriotic or defectors? And in our insane political climate, making an argument that Muslims are just people ends up being quite radical. So in conclusion, I am seeking to expand our understanding of how liberal logics produce these restrictive categories of what constitutes a good Muslim, and to show that the left and right are drawing from the same unquestioned logics. This category of the good Muslim takes several particular forms in liberal discourses. The good Muslim can be a patriotic Muslim, a nominal Muslim, a heroic Muslim, a moderate Muslim, or a Muslim defector. Not a Muslim who goes to school and eats sandwiches. It is assumed in this logic that to be pro-liberal principles as a Muslim is only possible if Islam is insignificant or irrelevant in one's life. It is through being